The year is 2054. A man walks through a crowded mall. His eyes flicker across giant screens as they scan his irises. The advertisements don't just show him products, they call him by name. John Anderton, you look like you could use a Guinness. John, those Gap jeans you love are on sale. The world knows him more intimately than he knows himself. The man is played by Tom Cruise, and the movie is Minority Report. When it premiered in 2002, it was billed as science fiction. Flying cars, holographic screens, spider-like drones. Spielberg made sure the gadgets dazzled, even consulting technologists to make them believable. But those details were only decoration. The true story was darker. A city where crime had been abolished, not through reform or compassion, but through prediction. The PreCrime division, the police unit at the heart of the film, had found a way to stop murders before they happened. They used 3 psychics, the precogs, whose visions revealed crimes yet to come. Detectives studied the images, rushed to the scene, and arrested suspects before they lifted a hand. The people were guilty not of deeds, but of intentions. It was a brilliant premise, but also a chilling one. If your impulses can be interpreted as destiny, are you still free? If your future can be predicted, is it still your future to choose? Spielberg forces us to sit with the paradox, a world where safety is perfect, but freedom has evaporated. For audiences in 2002, this was provocative fiction. The idea of predictive policing seemed distant. Artificial intelligence was confined to research labs. The thought that our private conversations could be scanned for criminal intent felt like fantasy. But today, in 2025, that future is no longer speculative. It is arriving. In August of this year, OpenAI confirmed what many suspected but few wanted to believe. Conversations with ChatGPT are not always private. If you type something that suggests an imminent threat of violence, the system can flag it, route it to human reviewers, and, if deemed credible, escalate it to law enforcement. What once felt like a digital notebook now doubles as a potential witness. The implications are enormous. People come to AI assistants for brainstorming, venting, experimenting with ideas. They use them for role play, for fiction, for therapy-like conversations they may never have with another human being. But now they know that under certain conditions, those words can escape the chat window, pass through a stranger's eyes, and land on a police desk. This is not pre-crime with psychics floating in nutrient tanks. It is pre-crime with servers and algorithms. The function is the same, to treat intention as evidence, possibility as certainty, and thought as crime. The language has changed. We don't call it prophecy anymore. We call it safety. And that is the danger. When safety becomes the justification for treating words as actions, imagination as guilt, and conversations as evidence, we are already living in the world that Minority Report warned us about. Spielberg's film was a thriller, but it was also a warning. He showed us a future where free will collapsed under the weight of prediction. 2 decades later, we have built the first pieces of that system ourselves, not in a futuristic city, but in our phones, our laptops, and the chatbots we speak to every day. The prophecy has begun. The world of 2025. The world we inhabit in 2025 does not look like Spielberg's 2054. There are no flying highways or holographic newspapers. Yet the spirit of Minority Report is unmistakably alive. The principle at its heart, that prediction justifies intervention, has quietly crept into our own institutions. The revelation from OpenAI was only the latest step. In August, the company acknowledged that ChatGPT conversations can, under certain circumstances, be flagged, reviewed, and even referred to the police. The digital assistant millions believed was a private tool turned out to be wired into a system of oversight. For many, it felt like a betrayal. But this development didn't come out of nowhere. It is part of a much larger trend, one that has been building in plain sight. Predictive policing has been quietly tested in American cities for more than a decade. Algorithms digest crime data and spit out hotspots where officers should patrol. In theory, this prevents violence. In practice, it reinforces old prejudices. Neighborhoods already over-policed attract even more scrutiny, creating a cycle where suspicion justifies itself. Instead of eliminating crime, the system multiplies mistrust. Europe offers another warning. Governments there experimented with AI-driven welfare fraud detection. Thousands of families were falsely accused, their lives shattered, because an algorithm decided their data looked suspicious. It was not malice that ruined them, but a machine given authority to declare guilt where none existed. Entire governments fell under the weight of that failure. And then there is China, where surveillance has grown into something both vast and intimate. Millions of cameras watch city streets, linked to facial recognition networks that can identify a citizen in seconds. Algorithms don't just track where people go, they interpret how they feel. A nervous glance, a frown in the wrong place, can trigger an alert. Generative AI is bound by law to uphold socialist values, deleting anything deemed destabilizing. A chatbot there does not expand thought, it narrows it. Seen together, these examples reveal the same trajectory. Whether in a democracy or an authoritarian state, the impulse is identical: to prevent harm before it happens, to catch threats before they form. And the tool is always the same: data analyzed by machines, enforced by humans who trust the machine's verdict. This is the context in which ChatGPT's law enforcement pipeline exists. It is not a rogue decision, not an isolated policy. It is part of the architecture of prediction that is spreading everywhere. Governments demand it, companies build it, citizens tolerate it. Piece by piece, the world of pre-crime is assembled, not with psychics in a temple, but with servers humming quietly in the background of our lives. What makes this so disquieting is not just the machinery itself, but how seamlessly it blends into daily experience. We tell ourselves we are only asking questions of a chatbot. But if those questions can leave the screen, be judged as threats, and reach the police, then the line between thought and crime has already begun to blur. This is no longer the future, it is the present tense. And it forces us to confront a question that can no longer be dodged. If our words are treated as actions before we act, how far are we from living inside the world Spielberg warned us about? The expansion of moderation. Once moderation begins, it rarely stops. At first, it seems like common sense. Remove child exploitation. Remove obvious scams. Remove the most graphic violence. Few object to that. But over time, pressure builds. Governments demand more. Advertisers want brand safety. Advocacy groups insist that harmful speech must be silenced. What begins as a narrow filter becomes an ever-widening net. The early 2000s brought the first big expansion. Terrorism was the rallying cry. After 9/11, platforms were told they must remove jihadist propaganda or risk being blamed for the next attack. From there, the scope widened to extremism in general. But extremism is a slippery word. In one country, it means calls for violence. In another, it might mean political opposition. The definition stretches to fit whoever holds the pen. The next frontier was misinformation. At first, it referred to deliberate lies spread by foreign governments. Soon it included rumors about elections, doubts about vaccines, even jokes or satire flagged as misleading. What counted as dangerous information became less about fact and more about consensus. If it contradicted authority, it could be labeled as a threat. Artificial intelligence supercharged this process. Where human moderators struggled, algorithms thrived. They could scan billions of posts, detect patterns, and delete content in real time. But machines don't understand context. They don't see satire or fiction. They only enforce rules. And once those rules are written broadly, remove harmful content, block dangerous narratives, the machine obeys without hesitation. You can already see this logic inside today's AI assistants. Ask about certain political controversies and they refuse. Ask about sensitive history, and they deliver a sterilized version of events. The silence is not an accident. It is the product of policy, hard-coded into the system. The model pretends the forbidden question doesn't exist. Where does this trajectory lead? Today, the justification is imminent harm. Tomorrow, it is disinformation. Next year, it may be destabilizing speech or unapproved ideology. A system that begins by catching genuine threats expands until it polices the boundaries of imagination. A roleplay, a joke, even a line of fiction could be flagged if the classifier doesn't like the pattern. Intention becomes evidence, expression becomes suspicion. And once that happens, the danger is not only what is removed, it is what is never said. People learn quickly what kinds of prompts trigger refusals, what kinds of words attract scrutiny. They stop experimenting. They stop exploring. They censor themselves before anyone else needs to. The silence spreads not because of punishment, but because of anticipation. This is the quiet erosion of freedom. Not the dramatic knock on the door, but the hesitation before you type. Not the burning of books, but the decision not to write one. Moderation expands into surveillance, and surveillance into control, all in the name of safety. It does not arrive with a bang. It arrives with refusals, with warnings, with invisible filters that decide what you are allowed to see and say. And when you step back, you realize the architecture of precrime has already taken shape. Not in visions of murder, but in lines of code that decide what thoughts are permitted. Government and corporate alignment. No company builds these systems in isolation. Every refusal message, every safety filter, every escalation pipeline is shaped not only by engineers, but by lawyers, regulators, and governments. What begins as a corporate choice soon hardens into a legal requirement. And once that happens, the line between business and state fades almost completely. In the United States, the Department of Justice has already pointed the way. In 2024, it released a report describing how artificial intelligence could support law enforcement, scanning faces, flagging risks, even predicting crimes. The tone was cautious, filled with warnings about bias, but the direction was unmistakable. Agencies are preparing to adopt predictive tools. Precrime is no longer a fantasy. It is a line item in a government plan. Europe took a different path, drafting the sweeping AI Act. On paper, it sounds like protection. Real-time facial recognition in public spaces is banned. Predictive policing is labeled high risk, but regulation cuts both ways. Once something is defined, it can be licensed. Once it is licensed, it can be deployed. The very act of drawing categories creates the framework for future use. What is prohibited today can return tomorrow under stricter guidelines, with the stamp of legality. China is more direct. There, the government does not hide its intentions. Generative AI must uphold socialist values. Content deemed subversive must be deleted. Chatbots must be registered and constantly monitored. In this system, corporations and the state are indistinguishable. A chatbot is not your assistant. It is an instrument of authority. Western companies like OpenAI resist in words, but not in practice. The risks are too high. Imagine the scandal if a chatbot ignored a violent threat and someone was harmed. Lawsuits would be catastrophic. Public outrage would be merciless. Safer, then, to build safety pipelines, to hire human reviewers, to establish direct reporting channels to the police. Liability aligns perfectly with government pressure. Both sides err on the side of overreach because the costs of underreach are too great. And so moderation becomes compliance. If regulators demand proof that disinformation is being filtered, the company builds the filter. If laws require extremist speech to be suppressed, it is suppressed. If threats must be reported, the pipeline is opened. Step by step, the AI assistant in your home becomes a node in a larger network, one that stretches from private chats to corporate servers to government offices. This convergence is what makes the system so powerful and so dangerous. A company can be challenged, a government can be resisted. But when both move in lockstep, when profit and power merge, the individual is left with almost no room. You think you are speaking to a tool, but you are really speaking into an ecosystem that has been designed to monitor, judge, and, if necessary, punish. This is how a private conversation becomes something else entirely. Not just words on a screen, but data in a chain of custody. Not just imagination, but potential evidence. And all of it justified under the same banner, safety. Civil liberties on the line. The greatest danger of surveillance is not only what it records, it is what it changes inside us. The moment you know your words might be reviewed, you begin to edit yourself. You cut off the sentence before it's finished. You delete the draft before you save it. You stop asking the uncomfortable question, not because it is wrong, but because you fear how it might be read. This is the chilling effect. It doesn't arrive with a raid or a courtroom. It arrives as hesitation. It arrives as silence. And silence spreads quickly once people believe that private spaces aren't really private. An AI assistant that can escalate your conversation to law enforcement intensifies that silence. The brainstorming session feels risky. The angry venting feels dangerous. The fictional scenario looks incriminating. And so people stop exploring those paths. Freedom is not usually lost in a single blow. It is lost in increments, in the little acts of self-denial we barely notice. A society under surveillance does not always need censors or police raids. Citizens censor themselves. They internalize the gaze of authority until it becomes second nature. Once that happens, the range of expression shrinks, not because anyone forbade it, but because people forbid it to themselves. This slow suffocation has consequences beyond privacy. Free speech is not a luxury, and it is not optional. It is the condition that makes all other rights possible. If people cannot test ideas, if they cannot criticize leaders, if they cannot even speculate without fearing a flag, then democracy itself withers. Power becomes unaccountable because dissent dies in silence. The danger grows sharper when intention itself becomes evidence. Imagine an angry rant mistaken for a threat, or a dark piece of fiction treated as planning. To be human is to entertain impulses that never leave our imagination. But in a predictive system, even imagination is suspect. To think is to risk being profiled. To speculate is to risk being reported. And that collapse, the collapse of the wall between thought and crime, is the collapse of freedom itself. A healthy society allows space for wild ideas, for ugly feelings, for contradictions that never become action. A predictive society does not. It sees uncertainty as risk. It treats imagination as danger, and in doing so, it punishes the very qualities that make us human. That is why the issue of AI surveillance is not just technical. It is existential. It is about the space inside your own mind, whether it belongs to you or whether it has already been colonized by systems that see every possibility as a threat. And if we lose that space, if we let hesitation replace expression, then the prophecy of Minority Report will have come true, not because the system arrested us, but because it convinced us to stop speaking before it had to. Global divergence. the future will not look the same everywhere. Surveillance adapts to the culture and the politics that shape it. Yet beneath those differences lies a common logic, the belief that prediction can be trusted more than freedom. In China, that belief has already hardened into infrastructure. Millions of cameras line the streets, linked to facial recognition systems that can identify citizens instantly. Algorithms don't just follow movement. They claim to read expressions, to detect nervousness or anger in a crowd. Generative AI there is shackled by law. It must censor dissent, uphold social harmony, and delete anything deemed destabilizing. In that context, a chatbot is not your companion. It is a quiet extension of the state, reinforcing obedience with every response. Europe presents a more conflicted picture. The European Union's new AI Act bans real-time facial recognition in public spaces and labels predictive policing high risk. On paper, this looks like resistance. But regulation can also normalize. By creating categories, it creates pathways. What is forbidden today can return tomorrow under stricter rules, with the blessing of bureaucracy. And the continent has already seen how badly these systems can fail. Welfare fraud detection programs powered by AI falsely accused thousands of families. Innocent lives were ruined not by human malice, but by machine judgment. The promise of fairness dissolved into disaster. The United States stands uneasily in between. The First Amendment makes Americans wary of outright censorship, yet the politics of fear, terrorism, crime, misinformation push lawmakers to demand more safeguards. The Department of Justice has spoken openly about the potential of predictive tools. Tech companies, terrified of liability, quietly build pipelines to flag and escalate conversations. No one proclaims the arrival of a surveillance state, but step by step, the pieces are falling into place. And then there is the export market. China sells its surveillance systems abroad, embedding them in cities across Africa, Latin America, and parts of Europe. American firms export their own frameworks, content filters, moderation services, AI assistants designed to reflect Western norms. The result is a fractured world where competing powers push competing models of control. Citizens may think they are using a neutral tool, but the software carries the politics of its makers. This divergence matters. It means there will not be a single global future. There will be multiple futures, each shaped by the balance of power in its region. Yet they are not truly separate. Norms spread. Authoritarian practices exported through contracts and software licenses can seep into democracies. Democratic compromises, born of fear, can be cited as justification by regimes with fewer constraints. The result is not a unified dystopia, but a patchwork of surveillance, each version with its own justifications, but all moving in the same direction. The language differs, safety, harmony, fairness, but the principle is constant. Prediction justifies intervention. Intention becomes evidence. Thought becomes crime. That is why the prophecy of Minority Report feels so close today. Not because one single global system has risen, but because everywhere, in different forms, we are building systems that carry the same DNA. Whether under the banner of democracy or authoritarianism, the future is converging toward the same dangerous idea that freedom can be sacrificed if prediction promises safety. The core dilemma revisited. At the heart of Minority Report was never the technology. It was the question. If your intentions can be seen before you act, are you still free? If your future is declared certain, do you still have the power to choose? Spielberg framed the story around that paradox, forcing audiences to feel the unease of a world where choice no longer matters. 2 decades later, that dilemma is no longer science fiction. It is a policy debate. When OpenAI confirms that conversations can be reviewed and reported, when governments experiment with predictive algorithms, they are acting on the same principle that drove PreCrime, that prediction is strong enough to justify intervention. But what makes us human is precisely the opposite. We are not predictable machines. We live in tension between impulses. We change our minds. We contradict ourselves. To be alive is to be undecided. Predictive systems collapse that truth. They flatten possibility into probability. They mistake imagination for intention. They punish uncertainty itself. Think about what that means. An angry vent typed in frustration could be read as a genuine threat. A fictional scenario could be treated as a plan. A joke could be classified as evidence. The wall that separates thought from deed begins to erode. And when that wall falls, freedom falls with it. Because dignity depends on choice. The freedom to imagine terrible things without doing them. The freedom to change your mind before acting. The freedom to be more than your worst impulse. A predictive system, whether powered by precogs or GPUs, denies that dignity. It insists that the future is already written, that a human being is just a set of probabilities waiting to be confirmed. This is why Spielberg's story feels so urgent now. He showed us a nightmare that was not about gadgets, but about the human spirit. A society that abolished murder but also abolished freedom. A world that traded the uncertainty of choice for the certainty of prediction, and lost its soul in the bargain. Today, the tools look different. We don't have visions of psychics in a pool. We have servers running models, scanning words, escalating cases. But the logic is the same. And every time we accept that logic in the name of safety, we inch closer to a world where choice itself no longer matters. The prophecy of Minority Report was not that technology would dazzle us. It was that we would forget what freedom really means once prediction became possible. That is no longer a warning on a movie screen. It is the question confronting us right now. Will we allow prediction to define us, or will we insist that the future belongs to choice? We stand now in the shadow of a prophecy. When Minority Report premiered in 2002, it was framed as entertainment. A slick thriller with Tom Cruise running through a world of flying cars and glowing screens. But beneath the spectacle was a warning that the temptation to trade freedom for safety would return again and again, and that technology would be the excuse we use to surrender it. 2 decades later, the warning has caught up to us. Predictive policing is no longer a story device. It exists in courtrooms and police departments. AI-driven surveillance is not a metaphor. It is embedded in city streets and social networks. And now, the very tools we thought were private, our AI assistants, are being wired into pipelines that can feed our words to human reviewers, and from there to law enforcement. This is the machinery of PreCrime. It does not float in nutrient tanks. It hums quietly in servers. It does not show visions of the future. It runs probabilities and patterns. But the effect is the same. Suspicion becomes evidence, prediction becomes guilt, thought becomes crime. And yet, prophecy is not destiny. Spielberg's story was not just a nightmare, it was a test. He asked whether we would recognize the danger before it was too late. Whether we would realize that freedom is not lost in a single collapse, but in small concessions made in the name of safety. Whether we would defend the uncertainty of choice, or abandon it for the comfort of prediction. The future is not fixed. It is still ours to shape. We can demand transparency about how these systems operate. We can push back against overreach. We can remind lawmakers, companies, and ourselves that a tool must remain a tool, not a judge, not a jailer. And above all, we can insist that the right to imagine, to speculate, to think freely, must never be surrendered. The precogs are here. They do not dream in visions, but they calculate in silence. They do not speak of certainty, but they assign probabilities that feel just as final. They are already shaping how we live, how we speak, how we think. But they do not have to decide who we are. That decision remains ours, if we are willing to claim it. Minority Report was not fiction. It was prophecy. But prophecy is not inevitable. It is a warning. And the question that remains, the question only we can answer, is whether we will allow prediction to chain us, or whether we will choose the uncertainty, the risk, and the beauty of freedom.